It's a little hard to know where to begin with Max Payne 3. The game is an indisputable classic, the final installment in one of the benchmark franchises that contemporary shooters measure themselves against, probably a bit more than that other early 2010s cover shooter we just talked about recently. It pushes every aspect of its gameplay to the absolute limits, which is exactly how the finale of a series like Max Payne should go. It is a culmination of all those technical and design sensibilities honed to a razor edge over not only the franchise history, but that of its adoptive producer, Rockstar Games. And yet, peeking out from underneath all of that are scattered moments of overwritten nonsense which, at its worst moments, speeds right past its attempt at deconstruction into being more a self-aware parody. An indisputable classic nonetheless. Max Payne is consistently one of the most objectively absurd and yet incredible shooter games of all time, and the third entry is no exception. I'm going to start by talking about the few gripes with the game that I have, and then we'll talk about all the good stuff. I hope you stick around and enjoy it. The first and most trivial thing to this video is actually a number I can't get out of my head every time I've played the game recently. $105 million went into developing Max Payne 3, which was at the time a blasphemous amount of money to put into a game. In 2024, according to Google, the average cost of making a AAA game is between $50 and $300 million, which to me still sounds just astronomical. I don't think that Max Payne 3 set the precedent for this enormous spending, but I do think that it was a harbinger for it. In 2012, it had one of the biggest budgets of any game ever, and didn't make that money back for a year after release, something that is all too commonly seen now. I do wonder what effects this had on the gaming industry. Nowadays, we have just shy of $1 billion being put into budgets for some of the biggest releases of the year. It might just be a personal shortcoming of imagination and research, that I can't understand exactly what it is that $100 million buys you when it comes to developing a game in 2012. If cramming the budget of a blockbuster action movie into your game was an attempt at putting the player as close as possible to the experience of playing in one, I'd say that Max Payne 3 was successful in its efforts. Maybe that weird feeling I have about the budget is at least partially answered by really the biggest problem I have with the game. The game is just a little bit bloated and overwritten. As much as I love Max as a character, and never mind a person being kind of one note as long as that note gets used smartly, here it's kind of used as like scattershot. Max refuses to just shut the fuck up sometimes and let moments stand on their own without commentary, instead exchanging a handful of one-liners, half-assed bitter jokes, and Debbie Downer over-exposition. Now, in the first two games, there were long comic strip scenes and tons of, inner monologuing on stuff that was going on, that was building a bigger picture and following this doomed detective arc. But in Max Payne 3, you get, long cutscenes full of genuinely impressive amounts of action, narration, and dialogue, but they just kind of drone on and on. I know, fresh coming from a guy that makes 20-minute YouTube videos talking about, 20-year-old games, but... And this isn't to say the game is badly written. For the most part, it isn't, but there's just so damn much of it. Max could be in the middle of telling you something pretty important, or just delivering some sort of killer line, only to be interrupted when he walks into the bathroom and picks up another bottle of painkillers, or something like that. The other, much lesser complaint I have with the game are the controls when I'm playing with mouse and keyboard. I remember it just feeling a lot better the first time I ever played on the PS3 a long time ago. It's not that the controls are bad, it's just that they kept confusing me, and there'd be moments where the action goes from totally fluid to upsettingly stupid based on how I was controlling Max. This is a skill issue, so I'm not docking the game points or anything for it, it just didn't help my personal frustrations any. I could probably have taken the time to rebind the controls and found something that worked better, but I didn't. Using the weapon wheel mid-combat is just stressful. Accidentally dropping my rifle over and over again is one of the most immersion-breaking things that you can imagine in a shooter game. Like, imagine if your main character in an action movie just couldn't seem to hold on to his gun and had to repeatedly stop doing gun battle things to, like, slowly pace around and then pick the gun back up. It was just bad puppeteering on my part. The handful of times the cover system seemed to not be working as intended were pretty much ignorable. And although I tend to get a little bit bored with cover shooters, Max Payne 3 has a way of keeping itself a lot more engaging that we will talk about. Lastly, and I'm not even going to spend a whole lot of time explaining this one, you get a lot of flashbacks and cutaways in this game where you'll pause in the middle of some action to go back to another time where there was a bunch of action, before coming back to the present moment action. Other times, after a 2-minute cutscene, you'll simply walk down a hallway and open a door, and another 2-minute video begins. Things in the game just are so unnecessarily paced, although to be honest, after I laughed while writing this entire section a few times, I realized that I also completely respect these, quote, bad parts, unquote, of the game. Never change, 2012 Rockstar. I'm sure you never ever will. It's hard to say exactly what Max Payne 3 is about, or if it is about anything at all. I think the game is less about world issues, poverty versus wealth, or even Max's journey to sobriety than we tend to give it credit for. To me, the game is primarily about ending the narrative with the highest amount of production value that could be had at the time. If the game is about those larger issues, it misses its own point almost entirely. Subverting the expected noir ending by, spoiler, keeping Max alive and walking off into the sunset also kind of misses the whole point of ending the series, especially the way it's repeatedly set itself up to. We'll talk about this more at some point. Maybe falling short of reaching a conclusion about itself is, in a strange way, the point. Sure, Max spends a lot of Act 1 stalking around the rim of rich people parties with his snarky inner monologues running on all cylinders. He constantly harps on about the world of difference between the haves and have-nots of Sao Paulo, but he doesn't believe in any of it. Max Payne doesn't believe in anything. He spends a great portion of the game risking his life over and over again to save a woman who is a member of the family of rich dicks he's so disgusted by. He's not really a crusader for the underclass, he's a bodyguard for the worst kinds of people. People who ultimately end up being the same types who he would have been working tirelessly to destroy in the first 2 titles. This is a relatively big deal for the overarching narrative. I understand not doing another continuation of the mob wars in New York, although there are some of those extended flashbacks I was talking about that take place in a very similar setting to the first 2 games, and were shown what Max Payne 3 could have been in that regard. But all that said, becoming a gun for hire in Brazil is, like, weird, right? Max has always been a sort of anti-hero, running from both mobsters and the law, who are always falsely accusing him of something and getting in the way of his pursuit of justice and answers. But by the 3rd entry, here at the end, Max is reduced to a goon, a slightly more respectable henchperson to a corrupt billionaire family whose home literally sits looking down on the poorest regions of Sao Paulo. Not only that, he's fallen so deeply into his addiction to pills and alcohol that he can barely remember moving from one event to the next, only snapping to attention when it's time to kill a whole bunch of people, then slinking back into the muck. The time it seems like most of his synapses are firing is when one bit of horrid violence reminds him of another bit, a cycle of creating new batches of post-traumatics. When we find him in the 3rd game, he's dangling one step above being the Valkyr addicts who killed his wife and child, kicking off the entire series all those years ago. The middle title of the series is called Max Payne 2: The Fall of Max Payne, and does indeed show us Max ultimately losing everything in his life and falling into the bottom. Max Payne 3 shows us what happens when the bottom shatters, and you go tumbling into the nothingness below the abyss. No. For time's sake, we're not going over the entire plot beat for beat. We'd be here all day. The central plot of the game features a lot of twists and turns. I say that, but none of the twists have much to do with Max the character. It's like he's been fighting one group of gang members and then another group of criminals is behind it, so he's fighting that group now too. Look, I was a lot more invested when it was about Max, I'm sorry. But we are going to do a little bit of plot, so all you really need to know right now is that there are a lot of different men in ski masks and military gear that belong to like 4 or 5 different factions, and they all have hidden connections and alliances. Now, most of the game has a dialogue that's in untranslated Brazilian Portuguese. Neither Max nor I speak the language, and so a lot of it goes over his head while he stands there looking tough.
Haven't you figured out I don't speak your fucking language?
That's okay. We, the players, and Max the Goon don't need to understand what's going on. You bet your ass that soon men with guns are going to show up and point them toward us, and we'll know everything we need to about the situation. That's all well and good from a gameplay perspective, and of course I'm oversimplifying. There are lots of clues scattered around each level that you can find, some of which are pretty well hidden, that will give you more exposition, in the form of Max's inner monologue, of course, what did you expect, about whatever's going on. And many times throughout the game, Max will say something along the lines of, I didn't need to speak the language to understand that, and then he'll also explain whatever's happening. The very first shot of the game is Max standing in his apartment, looking like a total wreck, before it fades into him standing in a room full of people. He's working security for this party on a high-rise when, yeah, you guessed it, men in ski masks with guns show up and try to kidnap several members of the Bronco family, the one-percenters that Max has been hired to help protect along with his new friend and business partner, Raul Passos. You're able to save them all, this time, and this is just about the happiest conclusion to any mission we'll have from here on out, and it's the first one. I really like this setup, because the rest of the game is nothing but failure after failure, as everyone around Max is whittled away by the violence around them. But how did Max end up here in the Southern Hemisphere? Well, that's where we see what the game could have been, had the developers at Rockstar done what people probably first anticipated, and made an updated version that rehashed the old sets and character types from the Remedy titles. We get flashbacks that explain how Max met Passos one ill-fated night in Hoboken, New Jersey, when the local mob boss's son tries to chest up to some retired cops and ladies in a dive bar and ends up getting himself killed. Of course, it never ends there, and immediately the entire local mafia and every contract killer in New England are out for Max's blood. Passos helps Max fight his way through the slums of New Jersey, gunning down about 100... Wait, what did you call them, sad Italian mob boss guy?
I'm coming after you, you motherfucking murdering bastard! Meet 100 angry greaseballs!
Thank you. So anyway, you fight your way out of the city and leave behind another reason to never return. All of this gets played out in segments that are cut up and put into the first act of the game in a way that still makes sense, but I both grimace and smile when I think of how the game goes in this sort of non-linear fashion for a while without fully committing. Personally, I think Rockstar did a fantastic job with these levels. It's just enough of an homage to the original style of the franchise before ripping the player back into the blinding sunlight and humidity. By a few chapters in, the primary focus of the game is to rescue the kidnapped trophy wife of one of the Bronco patriarchs. She was nabbed on your watch by the gang that's been targeting the family, led by a guy named Serrano. At the time, you were both too drunk and outnumbered to do much about it then, so you and Passos are put on the case. Trying to give the kidnappers the money they demand only results in getting even worse people involved, having picked up the scent of fresh cash and blood. The stadium scene is really the big indication that this is not going to be a badass action game where you're tearing through enemies and sending them running. This is a badass action game where there's always another few dozen bad guys to get through before limping your way to another seemingly dead end. Failing to get the girl multiple times but continuously forcing Serrano's pirate army back into a corner results in them not only shooting her, but endangering everyone else in the family. Soon, your main employer, the head of the family, is murdered in what appears to be a successful assassination, but is more an attempt on Max's life since he's getting way too close to the truth.
Of course.
See, Max was not supposed to survive this long, it turns out, and the further the chaos unfurls around him, the more it becomes apparent that the people he's been trusting and working for all have ulterior motives. Yet again, Max is just a small piece in someone else's game. Some things really never do change, huh? Oh, also, these worse people I was talking about earlier who ambushed Max and Passos make several returns. By the end of Act 2, every armed group in the city is outed to be either outwardly criminal or corrupt, especially the local police. You'll gun your way through favelas full of drug dens to a derelict super hotel that's been repurposed into an organ harvesting and human trafficking ring, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Hey, speaking of interesting locations and what you're doing in them, let's take a note away from the pacing of Max Payne 3 and do a sudden cutaway to talk about... There's not a whole lot of variety in the goal of each chapter. Like in Kane and Lynch or a bunch of other shooter games, you're always waiting for the next fight to break out and surviving the overwhelming odds against you. Also like Kane and Lynch 2, you're fighting an escalating sequence of street gangs, kidnappers, paramilitary, and eventually special forces soldiers with LMGs and full body armor. Urban warfare settings are one of my favorites in shooter games, and the Max Payne franchise handles it perhaps the best of any of them. In the first two games, it was because the drab noir setting fit the narrative and theme perfectly, but this is a Technicolor turbo action noir. The third game stands out mostly because of the absolute mastery of level design that's present here. Even the chapters I don't care as much for, like the paramilitary group's jungle fortress boat chase scene, are master classes in how evocative and detailed set design can be. To put it another way, even the few bad levels in Max Payne 3 are pretty damn good. My favorite levels are the favela scene I was alluding to earlier, the organ harvesting place at the Imperial Palace Hotel, and the UFE headquarters near the end of the game. Those are the corrupt police. Each of them were moments not only where things just sort of clicked for me, but had amazing cutscenes and narration to go along with the level design. The favela was my favorite level to walk through since it felt like such a believable public space, complete with hundreds of perfect details. The Imperial Palace and the UFE headquarters were both claustrophobic and intense, where the former felt like you were in a horror movie even before you stumble into the terrified surgeon's workshop, while the shootout through the corrupt police building provides a whole labyrinth of office space full of reactive environments. Computers explode, bits of desk and glass go flying all over the place, cubicles turn into trenches while you go against the small army of police in SWAT gear. Weapons in the game are generally good, only with some weird exceptions like pistols being better almost all the time than shotguns, which at least to me are basically useless. At a certain point in the game, it goes from incentivizing headshots by dropping enemies faster to being the only way of killing anyone short of dumping like 30 rounds into their body armor, so the MP5s and similar rifles and the good old pistols are always your best bet. Dual wielding makes a triumphant return, but unlike in the earlier games where you had basically an entire armory inside of your leather jacket, this inventory is limited to 2 one-handed guns and a single two-handed. I don't mind the more realistic approach, but I do desperately miss getting to carry explosives and melee weapons, even if the melee stuff didn't add a whole lot to the game. Only a few select enemies in the game get explosives, and Max doesn't, which can suck when there's a whole room of enemies in cover that you have to pick off one by one. The health system in the game is just genius, to put it simply. It's absurd, yes, but the need to constantly be dry swallowing painkillers, even in the middle of combat, is reflected perfectly in the rest of the story, with Max being a hopeless addict both to pain and the thing that numbs it. There's a little bit less punishment with the health system this time around. You won't die immediately when your pain meter fills, but drop to the ground and get a window of time to both shoot the guy who downed you and also down some pills. If you're out of painkillers, you'll just die. In another perhaps ironic twisting together of mechanics and intent, there's never really an ideal time to take them. If you're near full health, there's no need. If you're about to drop, you might as well wait to drop and save them for that. I'm not sure how intentional that is, but I did want to remark on it. Bullet time is something I've always had a weird feeling using in all 3 of the Max Payne games. It either doesn't occur to me to use it, or I tend to use it at the worst times. Diving straight into the middle of a group of enemies, or forgetting to aim before turning the damn thing on. Most of the first 2 games I had to simply brute force my way through. Not so on this last playthrough. I became a comparative bullet time master because I had to. This game, even on medium difficulty, is pretty hard at times, and it forces you to use cover and the slow motion to get through many areas. Once you do, you can begin to control the flow of combat much more proactively than you can when you're crouched behind cover in real time. The extra layers of technical polish across the board that Rockstar did here, from the way the environments react to the actual way the physics were tweaked to fit this particular game, are bullet time at its all-time best. I also like the way that some cutscenes end by transitioning into a bullet time moment, where you can either snipe down every enemy and land safely in another cutscene, or at least cut the numbers in half-ish by the time you hit the ground and another gunfight ensues. Another feature in the game acts as both an enhancement of something that's been in the trilogy from the beginning, and another clever use of bullet time, which uses it environmentally and cinematically. Often, when you've killed the last guy in an area, the camera will move to them and watch them fly back or fall down or whatever. Now, you can both slow down the camera if you'd like, and continue shooting them as they're dropping, making the moment as gory as possible. Jump cutting to a slow-mo shot of the dying guy falling backwards, clutching their chest, or flying through a window is classic action cinema, from spaghetti westerns and old James Cagney gangster films to stuff like John Wick. I'm assuming, I haven't seen it. It was present in the first Max Payne games as well, but here we're given this extra bullet-timey moment that feels almost like the executions from Manhunt. It's one of those things that push Max Payne 3 into what I call the watch list tier of games that I'm trying to corner the market in here on YouTube. All of these elements to this game, bigger, vibrant sets with insane details that end up suffering grander destruction, the paring down of inventory and scaling up of speed and maneuvering in combat, and the cinematography of it all really do create a blockbuster action movie feel that to many remains the pinnacle of third-person shooters from the time. Okay, cutaway over, let's wrap things up.
This was it. It was almost over.
During his time in the favela, Max makes the acquaintance of one of the few local cops who aren't corrupt, a guy named Wilson Da Silva. Here we meet a version of Max, even their last names both have the same general meaning. The surname Payne translated through Google means from the country, and Da Silva means from the forest. Moreover, I can't help but feel Da Silva lives only a few bad years behind where Max has ended up, obsessively chasing down corruption in his own ranks. I can't tell whether we're supposed to think that Da Silva is a better version of Max who never let his life be snatched away from him, or if he's another doomed detective who hasn't stumbled in too deep yet. Due to the whole, tone of the series, I think that we both know the intended answer. Either way, it's Da Silva who helps you out the most overall, besides maybe your trusty sidekick Passos. I use the term trusty here loosely. There is a moment where it seems like Passos leaves you completely in the lurch, typical of every character who hasn't pretty much outright died on Max since Game 1. This feeling is aided when our detective friend asks Max about a moment where this seems to be completely reinforced. There's one last flashback chapter, this time on a yacht in the Panama Canal, where it appears he and the youngest of the Bronco's sons have sent you and a whole boatload of victims sailing into a trap so they could smuggle some money. But that was a while back now. He and Max have been through a lot together, and you saved the mother of his unborn kid a few chapters earlier in the game. He comes back to save you at just the right time to save your life, and even if Max isn't immediately grateful, it is cool to see a character actually pull through for him. After squaring this last debt with you, he takes off with his wife for safety, leaving you and the detective to take down the remaining Bronco brother, who is working with the head of the corrupt police department. If it sounds like I'm skipping a lot, it's all of this is just like a little bit obvious, if I'm being frank with you.
So these punks,
Yes.
I don't know if they wanted money or they wanted something more sexual.
Wow.
But it's a lucky thing I had my pieces. My guns.
Oh.
Anyway, I started blasting. Bang!
Wow.
Bang! Well, I don't see so good, so I missed. Then they ran away. I ran after them.
Okay.
Bang! Try to shoot them in the back. But I don't run so good either. Anyway.
Here at the end, in these final levels, is where most of my favorite action in the game is. Where the disturbing as fuck climax of blowing up the human trafficker's derelict hotel and the one-man war against most of the cops in Sao Paulo happen. I do appreciate that finding the source of all this rot infecting the city takes you not to the lowest slums, but back to the dizzying penthouse heights where you started from. At this endpoint in the game, Max becomes the most ruthless and efficient killing machine that he's ever been. Now that he doesn't have a single thing left in the world to hang on to, no friends, no family, no home, no boss giving him direction, he has reached the apex of his ability and purpose, which is the same it's always been, to cut off the head of the snake. The final shootout through the airport is against the same army-style special forces that you fought at the Ufe headquarters, with Max deciding instead of driving around to where the two final targets are going to be, he decides to kill every member of the special forces along the way. The level is extensive, with whole terminals and backroom operations to shoot through, a tram ride and a mini-boss fight in the hangar, and finally Max and Da Silva chasing down the Bronco's private jet and blasting it out of the sky. As is all too often the case, Max figures that this will be a suicide mission, only unlike before, Max doesn't have any sort of savior complex, no employee motive, no personal revenge, no lost love. When he has these things to believe in or cling on to, he's always failing in some way. There's always a layer of confusion and backstabbing keeping him from the truth. Rid of any moral quandaries, we get the unstoppable Terminator Max that finishes things. That said, it's a strange choice to have ended the game with Max still alive. I truly wonder if Sam Lake reckoned this is where the story he began as a young writer at Remedy would end up. Part of me feels like it robbed the overarching narrative of a more satisfying conclusion, keeping Max alive to die of, cirrhosis or something. What's waiting for Max outside of a life of constant violent struggle we've been shown extensively with the Jersey flashbacks is not pretty. Whether he's off to do more mercenary work until he finally does meet his end, or he's been able to conquer all of his demons and he'll live quietly retired on a beach similar to the one we leave him on, is left vague, but kind of leans towards the latter. But the other part of me thinks that there's more to it. Maybe, and this is total speculation, the writers of Max Payne 3 wanted to show Max breaking out of his noir existence he was thrust into way back in the first game. There aren't the same hallmarks of noir here. The femme fatale has been replaced with a damsel in distress, or the contrast between the bleak color schemes of the first two games with a Brazil that's so vibrant and literally intoxicating that it distorts your vision. Were these replacements meant to change the tone of the game to a more fitting Rockstar title from the time? Were they meant to present the same ideas in a more revisionist noir setting? Or were they meant to finally free our main protagonist from the cycle he's been stuck in? It may be a combination or just a matter of perspective. But the truth is that Max had little to no motive for going through most of what happens in the game. The narrative itself has shockingly little to do with Max's personal life other than his addictions. The game instead has to hold him up like a cracked and dirty mirror, and what we're seeing is the shattered reflection of the world through his eyes. I don't mind this, by the way, except when I go digging for deeper meaning into it. Take Max's supposed sobriety, for example. As Max quits drinking in the game, his situation doesn't become better, his perspective on it only becomes clearer. He's not happier, only less malleable. His motives don't change, nor his disposition. He's still our grumpy old nihilist, just a little more clear-headed. And he's still popping pills, which I'm grateful for as a player, but confused by when I'm trying to process the whole thing. Does this mean something, or am I just supposed to go along with it? As anticlimactic as it may sound, I'm inclined to just go along with it. I think, ultimately, that Max Payne 3 is one of those almost perfect shooter games that's both so well written and made that we keep going back to it looking for both entertainment and meaning. I don't think that the game rejects having any bigger message or theme, but I do think it delights in confounding them. Having pushed everything in the game to its technical and narrative limits, Rockstar ended the Max Payne series with an indisputable classic that we're still finding things to talk about in it to this day. To be honest with you, it's a little hard to know where to end with Max Payne 3. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope that you didn't find the ending too abrupt. I'm a sucker for a shoddy palindrome. And if you did make it this far, you're awesome. I would love to hear what you think about the game, or let me know what you want to see next. People seem to like me covering the classic games, which I did not expect, but we will continue doing. If you do check out some of my indie game essays, I would appreciate it so much. As of writing this, the channel is almost halfway to being eligible for becoming a YouTube partner, something that I did not see happening for a very long time. So thank you sincerely again, and I hope that I'm earning your views and support as I try to move into doing this professionally. I will see you at the next one.